My name's Anne Richardson, and I'll be talking about what if cancer screening can cause harm as well as benefit. I'll only be talking for about 3/4 of an hour, so there'll be plenty of time for questions afterwards. So what I want to do tonight is briefly introduce cancer screening and then look at 3 questions. Firstly, what are the potential benefits and harms of cancer screening? And then why are the benefits of cancer screening sometimes overestimated? And then finally, how do the benefits and harms of screening for different cancers compare? So firstly, the introduction to cancer screening. I think most of us, when we think about cancer screening, focus on the benefits. So mostly we think picking up cancer early must be a good thing to do. And the definition of cancer screening really lends itself to that as well, because it's basically the examination of asymptomatic people in order to classify them as likely or unlikely to have the cancer that's the object of screening. And the idea is to detect cancer before the person has any signs or symptoms, and hopefully for that early detection to improve the outcome for people with cancer. However, the problem, or a problem with cancer screening, or any type of screening really, is that no cancer screening test is perfect. And what the test is designed to do is to divide people into 2 groups based on whether they're likely or unlikely to have the cancer that's being screened for. So if we look at this diagram, the screening test for cancer divides people into people with positive and negative screen results. But for people who have a positive result, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have cancer. In fact, most people who have a positive result don't have cancer. And so if you have a positive test, you then go on and you're invited to have further investigations, which may be for mammography, for example, could be extra films, or it could be a biopsy. Now, for some people, the result of the biopsy or other test will show that they do have cancer. And so those people end up in this group, the true positive group. For people who've had the extra investigations but they don't have cancer, those people fall into this group, the false positive group. And, the false positive group unfortunately have been made anxious by the fact that they've had a positive test, and they've had investigations that have turned out to be unnecessary because they actually don't have cancer. So in the absence of a screening program, they would have avoided those potential harms. Now, most people who are screened fall into this group, because even for a really common, relatively common cancer such as breast cancer, most of the people who are screened don't have the cancer. So most people will have a negative test, and for most people that will be the correct result. So most people will fall into this group, the true negative group. But for a very small number of people, the test will have missed the fact that they have cancer. And that group of people will be in this box here, the false negative group. Now, unfortunately, sometimes what happens to people in that group is that because they've had a negative screen result, they feel reassured, and then if they develop any signs or symptoms later, potentially they might not seek advice as early as they otherwise would have. So the potential there is for that group that screening has achieved the opposite to what you would hope, that in fact the diagnosis for that group has been delayed potentially. So you can see already just with an introduction to screening that there are some potential harms as well as the benefits that we all intuitively understand. So part of the reason for this is to do with the test, obviously, and how good it is at dividing people into the positive and negative groups. And that aspect of a screening test is known as its validity. And that's divided into two estimates. One is the sensitivity of the test. That's how good it is at correctly identifying people with the cancer. And the specificity of the test, which is how good it is at correctly identifying people without the cancer. And really what you want is a test that's good in both of those dimensions. So you want a test with high sensitivity and high specificity. And if you have a test that is like that, you're minimising the number of people falling into the false positive and false negative groups. However, the problem with a screening test is that the results of a screening test for people with the cancer and people without the cancer tend to overlap. So if we think about prostate screening, for example, the PSA test, the results of PSA testing will overlap for men with cancer and men without cancer. So in this diagram, the men without cancer are up the top here. Oh, goodness. Sorry, I hit the wrong button there. So the men without cancer are in this top group, and the men with cancer are in this bottom group. And so some men, in other words, without cancer, will have a high PSA result, and some men who do have cancer, will have a low PSA result. So the best we can do with a screening test is use a cutoff that is represented by this dotted line here. And you can see that that's not perfect, because if you say that everybody above this dotted line is positive and everyone below is negative, you will miss some people with cancer, and you will tell some people without cancer that they have a positive screening test. So you could think, okay, well, the more important thing is really not to miss anybody with cancer. So why don't we shift the cutoff so that we don't miss anybody with cancer? And that way we'd have a test with 100% sensitivity. But the trouble is, if you do that, this is what happens. We shift the cutoff so that none of the people in this group with cancer are missed. But the problem then is that all the people without cancer, and of course that's most of the people who are screened, you end up telling maybe half of those people that they've had a positive screening test. And so that's really unsustainable for two reasons. One is that you would end up investigating far too many people. And the second reason is that people would lose faith in the screening program, because they would realise very quickly that it didn't make sense for about half the people who were screened to be told they had a positive screening test. So that's why we end up with this trade-off, really, where the cut-off for screening for a positive test is round about here with the dotted line, which means that you do get some false positives and you also get some false negatives. Okay, so that's just the introduction, so that people realise that screening is never going to be perfect, and that there will always be some false positive and false negative results. So now if we think about weighing up the benefits and harms of screening, one easy way to do that is just to show a table with the benefits on the left there and the harms on the right. The benefits are the things that basically we all hope for when a screening program is introduced. So what we hope is that for the people in that true positive group, that at least some of them will gain extra years of life as a result of having their cancer detected early. And also, some of those people will have less advanced or difficult treatment because they have an earlier cancer, and so the treatment might be able to be simpler than for someone who has a cancer that's more advanced. And then lastly, there is a benefit for some people with negative screen results, and those are the people who have been maybe anxious about cancer anyway, and so when they have a negative result, they feel reassured. And some people will count that as a benefit, and other people will argue and say that's not a benefit. All you're doing is offsetting the anxiety that you've caused by inviting people to screening. So that one is a very individual outcome, whether or not you would regard it as a benefit or not. Then in the right-hand column here, the harms, are that for some people in the true positive group, even though their cancer has been diagnosed earlier, it may not be early enough to extend their life. So the cancer's been picked up early, but not early enough to make a difference. Also, for some people with early cancer, if it is the case that the cancer hasn't been picked up early enough and those people are offered treatment, then potentially that's treatment that they may not have benefited from. Or for people whose cancer is picked up so early that it was never destined to affect them during their lifetime anyway, in the absence of screening, then they may receive treatment that is unnecessary and that they would not have needed in the absence of screening. And if there are any side effects to that treatment, then that's a potential harm to those people. And then lastly, the two groups that you're familiar with. So the people with the false negative results may be falsely reassured, as we discussed earlier, and may potentially delay seeking advice if they develop symptoms. And the people in the false positive group will have felt anxious because they've received a positive screening test, and then they will have had investigations that turn out to have been unnecessary. Now, the problem with screening is that sometimes it's difficult to assess whether or not a screening program is beneficial. And even if it is, it can be difficult to set the program up in such a way that it delivers the benefit that it should, because these programs can be very complex to deliver with very high quality. And the problem with screening is that if it's the case that there isn't a benefit to screening, or that the program doesn't deliver a benefit that should exist, the harms will still be there. And so this is the outcome of the program, that the net outcome for people is that the program causes harm rather than benefit. And so that's a real risk associated with screening, and it's why people focus so much on having good evidence and having quality control in screening programs. And it's also why this aphorism was developed. And Sir Muir Gray was the person who developed this saying, and he said, all screening programs cause harm. Some do good as well. And at the time that he said this, he was director of screening for the UK, and subsequently he became the knowledge advisor for the National Health Service in the UK. And it's sort of the opposite to what we would normally think. I think most of us would think all screening programs cause benefit and some do harm as well. But in fact, he turned it round because of the possibility that screening programs could cause harm even if they're not causing benefit. Now, this is actually a really important concept and leads to ethical implications, because screening programs are different from what we do elsewhere in the health system. And they differ in three really important ways. The first is that screening is initiated by the health system. So it's not like other aspects of healthcare, where maybe you or I develop some signs or symptoms or some concerns, and we approach the health system in order to seek advice or help. It's not like that with screening programs. The way that they work is that an invitation comes out to us, and we're invited to take part. So it's a different initiation. The second difference is that screening programs are offered to people who are, to all intents and purposes, well. So they're people who do not have the signs and symptoms of the disease. And the reason that that is important is that people who are well may be less accepting of adverse effects. And again, that's different from elsewhere in the health system, where people are prepared to accept adverse effects in order to get better. So people who are already unwell are prepared to take medicines even though they know that some of those medicines have side effects. And people who are unwell are also prepared to undergo surgery and have general anaesthetics, even though most people are frightened of having a general anaesthetic and having surgery. But people will do that in order to get better. It's not the case in screening programs because people are not sick to begin with. The third important difference is that when one of us approaches the health system with a problem, we are not guaranteed that we'll be better off. Basically, we know, we trust that the health professional will do the best that he or she can, given current knowledge. In screening programs, it's different because when they're advertised to us, they're advertised with this understanding of benefit. And if you think about the television advertisements for breast screen Aotearoa, for example, they say it could save your life. So it tends to be that the benefit is uppermost. The other issue is that in screening programs, the benefits and the harms accrue to different individuals. So if we think about somebody who's sick taking a treatment, as I said earlier, that might have side effects, but for that person, those side effects might offset the fact that they are getting better because of the treatment. In a screening program, the benefits and the harms don't all accrue to the same individuals. So there isn't necessarily that trade-off for people. And actually this ethical issue was recognised over 40 years ago when Cochrane and Holland made the statement that's up there, really saying that because of these differences between screening and other healthcare initiatives, there's a very strong ethical obligation on those who offer screening to ensure that there is a benefit to be gained. And that has led, this ethical obligation has led to the development of principles of screening, initially back in the 1960s by the World Health Organization. So they developed a set of principles to guide decisions about screening programs. And then various countries around the world, including New Zealand, developed their own criteria. So in New Zealand, these criteria were developed in 2003. And the reason that we have criteria is because we do not want to establish screening programs where the harms would outweigh the benefits for the population being screened. Now, I won't go through each of these criteria because I think they're self-explanatory, but I do want to emphasise one of them because this particular criterion shows how screening can potentially harm not only the people in the program, but people outside the screening program if screening is not planned appropriately. So the criterion I want to focus on is this one, that the healthcare system will be capable of supporting all necessary elements of the screening pathway, including diagnosis, follow-up, and program evaluation. Now, the reason that this is important is because when you first introduce a screening program, it has flow-on effects in the rest of the health system. And this is a sort of simple diagram, but it is supposed to show what happens when a screening program is first introduced. And the best analogy, I think, for a new screening program is to think of it a little bit like a fishing expedition. So if you imagine that every year you go fishing in the same waterhole and you go fishing with a net. And each year you go to the waterhole, you put your net into the water and you catch a certain number of fish. And let's assume that there's a sort of steady state in the fish population. So you'd expect that each year you did that, you'd catch roughly the same number of fish. Now, one year you get for Christmas a new net. And this net has much finer mesh than your old net. So this year when you go to the fishing hole and you put your net in, you not only catch the fish that you would have caught, usually, but you catch a whole lot of smaller fish that would have swum through your old net. And that's what it's like with a screening program. When it's first introduced, you will diagnose people who would not normally have been diagnosed maybe for a year or even 2 or 3 years. So in that particular year, not only do you have people, the usual number, if you like, of people being diagnosed with cancer, but extra people as a result of the screening program. So that means that people who have positive screening tests will need investigations. And so if this red line is the investigations needed to be provided by the health system, then what happens is with screening, you get this blip, if you like, as a result of the new net. Whereas the blue line is what you would expect in the absence of screening. And you can see that even after your initial blip resulting from the screening program, you've still got an excess here compared with the blue line because of the false positive tests arising from the screening program. So it never goes back down to the steady state that you had before. And if that's not planned for, you can predict what would happen, that you'd get long waiting lists in the health system for everybody that needs those particular investigations and everybody that needs treatment for that particular type of cancer. And if that's not planned for, then the screening program inadvertently will harm not only the people in the program, but the people outside the program who are having to wait longer for those investigations and that treatment. Okay, so that's just sort of thinking about some of the potential harms of screening that are not always acknowledged. But the other issue with screening is that sometimes the benefits that we all seek and that we all acknowledge can actually be overestimated. And I just want to go quickly through why that happens. So the main problem with estimating or trying to measure the benefits of screening relates to bias. And in research, a bias is something that causes results to deviate from the truth. And unfortunately for screening, there are 4 biases that operate which will cause the results to appear to be better or worse than they really should. And with screening, most of these biases will overestimate the benefits of screening. So if we just use an example where we're taking a worst case scenario. So let's assume that we have a screening test which picks up disease early, it picks up cancer early, but not early enough to make a difference. So although the test will detect cancer before people have any signs or symptoms, it won't make a difference to the outcome for those people. Now, in that worst case scenario, first we'll look at what happens with lead time bias. So in this diagram we have two individuals represented by the two horizontal lines. The person at the top here is someone who has been screened, and the person at the bottom is someone who has not been screened. And you can see that they're similar in the sense that they both develop cancer at the same time and they die at the same time. So each person develops cancer here at point X, and each person dies here. But the person who's screened has their cancer detected earlier, here. The person who's not screened is not diagnosed until later when they develop signs or symptoms. So they're not diagnosed until here. Now, if we look at one way that people sometimes assess screening, we can look at survival time. And if we compare these two individuals, you can see that the survival time is different for the two people, even though they developed their cancer at the same time and they died at the same time. Because survival time is measured from the time of diagnosis until the time of death, the person who has been screened will have a longer survival time than the person who was not screened, even though screening made no difference to the outcome. So lead time bias really overestimates the benefit of screening. So in other words, it's not a good way of assessing whether screening works. The second bias is called length bias, and this relates to the fact that, as you all know, cancers grow at different rates. And so some cancers will grow quite slowly and other cancers will grow very quickly. And it tends to be that the slow-growing cancers have the better prognosis than the fast-growing cancers. So in this diagram, these horizontal lines are supposed to represent cancers growing at different speeds. So this one here, for instance, is a slow-growing cancer, and these ones here are fast-growing. And the length of each line represents the time during which a cancer could be detected by screening before the person has developed any symptoms. So each of those lines represents what's called the pre-symptomatic screen detectable phase. Now, because we screen at intervals, you can probably predict what's going to happen here. We have a much better chance of picking up the slowly growing cancers. And in fact, we can miss completely some of the fast-growing cancers. So you can see that here, that with screening at intervals, we've missed these two cancers and they have gone from being undetectable by screening right through to causing signs and symptoms in between each screening round. And so what that does is it means that if you compare the outcome for people whose cancers have been detected by screening with people whose cancers have been detected symptomatically, it's like comparing apples with oranges, really. And again, this particular bias will overestimate the benefits of screening. So we've now looked at 2 biases out of 4, both of which will make screening look better than it should. The third bias is called selection bias, and this is to do with the fact that when people are invited to be screened, they don't always take up the offer. And it may be that the people who choose to be screened are different from the people who choose not to be. The problem with selection bias is it can go in either direction. So, for example, if people who choose to be screened are very health conscious and they're healthy in all sorts of ways, it may be that they're at lower risk of dying from that particular cancer anyway. And if they preferentially take up the offer of screening, then that will make screening look better than it should. On the other hand, if people who are at high risk, maybe because they have a family history, for example, take up the offer of screening, preferentially, then that will make screening look worse than it should, because the people who are being screened are at higher risk than the people who are not being screened. So that's a difficult one because it could overestimate or underestimate the benefits of screening. Then the last bias is called overdiagnosis bias, and this relates to the fact that cancer screening picks up disease early. And of course that's what you want it to do, but there is a downside to that, because for some people screening will pick up their disease so early that it was never destined to affect them in their lifetime. And in the absence of screening, they would not have known they had cancer at all, and they would have gone on to die from something else. Now, if screening causes overdiagnosis, in other words, it picks up cancers that would otherwise not have been detected at all, then again, when you compare the outcome for people who have been screened with people who have not, it will tend to make screening look better than it should. So we have 4 biases, 3 of which will definitely overestimate the benefits of screening, and the 4th one, selection bias, could go either way. So it makes it very, very difficult to know, really, whether screening programs are beneficial or not. And in fact, there's only one research design that will do that properly. And before I go on to that, I just want to give one example of overdiagnosis. And this is to do with prostate cancer. And it's the reason that prostate cancer screening has been so controversial. And what this figure shows is the results of a study carried out in America where men who died unexpectedly, mostly from accidents or from homicide, were examined after death. So what happened was these men were killed unexpectedly. They were healthy men. None of them had been diagnosed with prostate cancer. But after death, at the autopsy, their prostates were removed and examined extremely carefully under a microscope for signs of prostate cancer. And what you can see here is the results for African American men in the red bars, or purplish red bars, and all other men in the green bars. Now the problem that you see here is that for men over the age of about 50, which is the age that a lot of men are encouraged to seek prostate screening, there's about more than a 50% chance that if you look for prostate cancer, you'll find it. But of course, we know that it's not the case that over half of men die from prostate cancer. So there's a mismatch here. And that's related to what we call overdiagnosis, that if you look hard enough, you will find evidence of prostate cancer in a very high proportion of men, and that proportion goes up very steeply with age. So that's a real risk associated with screening for prostate cancer. So the only study design we know of which can deal with all 4 biases is a randomised controlled trial using mortality or death rates from the cancer in question as the outcome measure. And the reason that I'm emphasising this particular study design is these trials usually take many years to carry out. They're expensive, they involve large numbers of individuals taking part. And so sometimes people become really impatient with them and they think, why are we waiting all these years to get an answer before we introduce screening? Because most people are thinking of the potential benefits. But in fact, we have just looked at all the potential harms, which are why we really do need to wait for the best available evidence, which is from this type of study, a randomised controlled trial. Okay, so finally, the last question that I wanted to look at was, how do the benefits and harms of screening for different cancers compare? Because they're not all going to be exactly the same. And we're asked in these talks to, where possible, use our own research. So what I wanted to do was just look at a paper that a colleague of mine, John Potter, and I published, looking at benefits and harms of screening for bowel cancer compared with prostate cancer. And the reason we wanted to look at these two cancers was because obviously we don't have national programs for screening programs for prostate cancer or for bowel cancer in New Zealand, although there is a pilot program for bowel cancer screening in Waitemata. In the US Preventive Services Task Force has recommended strongly against prostate cancer screening because they feel that the benefits and harms are too close. And in fact, you could look at the harms and think, well, actually they potentially might outweigh the benefits. And a table had been developed by the US Preventive Services Task Force, really weighing up the benefits and harms for prostate screening. But no one had done that for bowel screening. So that's what we looked at. And the thing to be aware of or to keep in mind is that both of these cancers are important causes of illness and death in New Zealand. So this shows age-standardised rates for cancer per 100,000 population for New Zealand, and the red bars are new diagnoses and the blue bars are deaths. And so what you can see is that prostate cancer, breast cancer, which we do have a screening program for, and bowel cancer, which is also known as colorectal cancer, are really important cancers in terms of their impact on people's lives in New Zealand. And that's the case worldwide, actually. So if we look at a similar diagram for worldwide cancer incidence and mortality, you can see the pattern's a little bit different because patterns of cancer incidence and mortality differ across the world in different countries. But overall, you can see that bowel cancer, colorectal cancer and prostate cancer are within the top 5 cancers worldwide. So clearly important. However, if you look at screening for these cancers and look at that worldwide, it's very different picture. So more than 17 countries have national bowel screening programs, and 6 at the moment have pilot screening programs. So that includes New Zealand. But there is no country in the world that has a national prostate cancer screening program. And if we look at the potential benefits and harms for prostate screening and bowel screening, I think it becomes apparent why there is this difference. So here we have a table which I hope is not too small to read, but in order to get it all onto the one slide so you could compare them, we've got screening for 1,000 people at least screened over 10 years for each of these cancers. And then on the left-hand side we have the benefits, and on the right we have the harms. So for prostate cancer screening, you can see that screening 1,000 men for 10 years, you may extend the life of one man. On the other side, in terms of harms, there will be false positive results for between 100 and 120 men. And of course, bearing in mind the slide that we saw earlier, which is that if you look hard enough for prostate cancer in men over 50, you've got a very high chance of finding it, which means that those men going on to have biopsies are at quite high risk of overdiagnosis or of having a cancer diagnosed that would never have affected them during their lifetime. Add to that there are complications of biopsy, potentially, sometimes quite serious infections, and with men ending up in hospital as a result, for 30 of the 1,000 men. Prostate cancer is diagnosed in 110 men. Now, normally you wouldn't put that in a harm column, but the reason it's there is because what we're weighing up is the potential gain. So what we've got is up to one man in the 1,000 whose life might be extended by the screening program of 110 men who've been diagnosed. And then there are complications of treatment in between 20 and 30 men, because of the 110 men, there are 3 possible treatment options that are normally offered to men. They include what's called watchful waiting, which is just sort of monitoring without any treatment to see how things go, or surgery or radiotherapy. Now, for men who accept treatment, and in Europe it's 70% of men, even with early prostate cancer, who will accept invasive treatment such as radiotherapy or surgery. In the US it's 90% of men who will accept treatment. And those treatments do carry side effects such as incontinence and impotence in some men. Bowel cancer screening, you can see this is fecal occult blood testing. That's the screening test that's being used in the pilot screening program in Waitemata. So for 1,000 people being screened for bowel cancer, between 1 and 2 people will have their lives extended. And you can see that obviously that's a better gain, but also the harms are less than for prostate cancer screening. So fewer people will undergo false positive results with unnecessary follow-up. Fewer people will experience complications. The trade-off is much, much better. So for every 5 to 6 people diagnosed with cancer, 1 to 2 will actually benefit in terms of extra years of life. And fewer people will experience complications of treatment. Now, flexible sigmoidoscopy is another type of screening test for bowel cancer, and that tends to be offered as a one-off test, whereas fecal occult blood testing is offered every 2 years. Flexible sigmoidoscopy is just offered once, usually at the age of 50 or maybe 55. And it's much better at picking up cancer than fecal occult blood testing. But the other thing about it is it will pick up polyps, which could potentially develop into cancer later. So it has the advantage not only of picking up cancer early, but potentially preventing the development of cancer in some people. So you can see that here the benefits are stepped up again. So extra years of life, which are similar to fecal occult blood testing, plus bowel cancer prevented in 5 people out of every 1,000, weighed up against these harms, which again are considerably less than for prostate cancer. So hopefully that slide sort of answers the question about why worldwide the decisions about screening programs are so different for prostate cancer screening and bowel cancer screening. Now, for New Zealand, we face challenges really when it comes to screening. The first is colonoscopy capacity. So for bowel cancer screening, the investigation that is offered to people who have positive screening results is a colonoscopy. And at present in New Zealand, we do not have enough trained people who can perform those colonoscopies. So we cannot roll out a national screening program without creating the harms that I talked about earlier, where potentially you could increase waiting times for people even outside the screening program. So that's something that really needs to be planned for, and it's been estimated that after the introduction of a national bowel screening program in New Zealand using fecal occult blood testing, you would need to be offering colonoscopies to over 18,000 extra people in that first year. Then the second problem that we have is the impact of unplanned PSA testing. Now, we don't have a screening program for prostate cancer, but a lot of men do actually have PSA tests. And it's been estimated that in New Zealand every year it's over 140,000 men who have PSA tests. But that is not planned for, of course, because we don't have a prostate cancer screening program. And what that means is that we have, in effect, the unplanned fishing expedition where we get the blip, where people require investigations as a result of having positive PSA tests, and that potentially causes harm to people outside the screening, although it's not really a screening program, it's unplanned screening. So that's something that really is a challenge for New Zealand, how to deal with that. And then finally, for all screening programs really, how to provide accurate information to people about the benefits and the risks so that when they receive an invitation to be screened, they really can make an informed choice. And across the world, screening programs are moving in this direction. So in Britain, for example, in the National Health Service breast screening program, they have just developed a leaflet which sets out the benefits and risks, rather like the table that I showed earlier, so that women can weigh it up, because people will make different decisions based on how they see the benefits against the risks or the harms. And that enables them to do that with really good information. And then finally, I'd just like to acknowledge my research colleagues, some of whom are here tonight, thank you, and also study participants in various studies that we've carried out over the years looking at screening and the evaluation of screening programs. Also the Wayne Francis Charitable Trust, which funds some of our research, the Canterbury Medical Research Foundation, the Health Research Council of New Zealand, the Cancer Society of New Zealand, and the New Zealand Breast Cancer Foundation. Thank you very much.